Noches, muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Hoy soy Ruben Gallo de la Universidad de Princeton y estamos aquí para presentar este libro que es como una carta de amor a La Habana, que se llama La Habana Moderna, publicado por la Editorial Arquine en Ciudad de México, y están con nosotros hoy varios de los autores que van a contarles un poco cómo ellos han pensado ciertos edificios icónicos de La Habana desde un lugar tan lejano como Princeton, que queda cerca de Nueva York. Este es el libro, tenemos unos ejemplares a la venta, entonces después si alguno de ustedes quiere comprar un ejemplar, estarán por aquí. Vamos a empezar. Quería, antes que nada, darle la bienvenida a Miquel Adrià, el editor de Arquine. Muchas gracias, Miquel, por y le voy a pedir a Miquel que nos cuente un poco la historia del proyecto.
Buenas noches. Soy Miquel Adrià, arquitecto, dirijo la Editorial Arquine en México. Y la historia es la historia o la relación con Ruben Gallo, previa, durante y después de este libro. Yo diría que sobre todo parte de otro libro que habíamos hecho años atrás sobre Tlatelolco, que es un barrio, es una ciudad dentro de la ciudad de los años 60, cuando ya parecía imposible llevar a cabo el proyecto de la modernidad a ese tamaño, una ciudad de 2 kilómetros de largo por 500 de ancho, y ahí Ruben participó con un texto súper entrañable. De hecho también publicamos unos proyectos de Terence, y ahí empezó esta relación. Posteriormente surgió esta idea y cualquier cosa que cuenta Ruben la hace apasionante, la hace atractiva. Yo creo que hasta si Ruben nos cuenta la aburrida vida de un burócrata 8 horas al día, la puede contar y nos lo puede parecer apasionante, y todos vamos a querer ser burócratas sentados en la misma oficina. Nos atrapó y ya estábamos pensando en otros proyectos editoriales. Este nos pareció fascinante. Desde Arquine lo que hacemos básicamente es publicar libros que nos gustan. Nunca hemos hecho un estudio de mercado. Nos interesa mucho la arquitectura, la historia de la arquitectura, el antes, el después, el durante de la arquitectura, y este libro nos pareció apasionante y estamos muy agradecidos que nos hayas invitado. Gracias.
Bueno, y quería decir que para todos nosotros ha sido un honor trabajar con Miquel, porque Arquine es una editorial maravillosa que hacen unos libros de una gran calidad de producción, y además Miquel y todo su equipo son apasionados de la literatura y de la arquitectura, no solamente mexicana, latinoamericana, española y mundial, global, yo diría. Entonces, a través de Arquine se ha venido produciendo una reflexión muy fina, muy lúdica sobre la arquitectura en varios lugares del mundo. Bueno, quería contarles muy brevemente la historia de este proyecto. Esto nace de una colaboración con Beatriz Colomina, que está aquí. Gracias por acompañarnos, Beatriz. Beatriz estará hablando mañana sobre su trabajo en el taller de Fernando Martiguena. Y hace unos años, Beatriz y yo en Princeton hicimos un seminario de posgrado sobre arquitectura moderna cubana. Y entonces, bueno, es un tema que ha sido trabajado por muchos especialistas, por Eduardo Luis Rodríguez, que está aquí, y lo que queríamos hacer era, digamos, hacer una especie de laboratorio, invitando a nuestros estudiantes de doctorado, de arquitectura, pero también de otras disciplinas, de otros departamentos, a que miraran la arquitectura de La Habana sin ser especialistas, muchas veces sin haber venido a La Habana, y que nos dijeran qué veían, cómo pensaban estos edificios en relación con otra problemática de la arquitectura. Y bueno, fue un seminario muy bonito. Trajimos a los estudiantes a La Habana, recorrimos todos los edificios y siempre es un gran descubrimiento haber estudiado un edificio y después no solamente verlo en persona, sino poder circular por él, ver cómo funciona el espacio. Y entonces, bueno, hoy vamos a presentar 4 proyectos que están aquí en el libro. El primero, se los voy presentando uno por uno. El primero es de Sylvia Lavin, que también es colega de Princeton, profesora de la Facultad de Arquitectura. Antes de llegar a Princeton fue decana de la Facultad de Arquitectura de la Universidad de Los Ángeles. Es una gran especialista, no solamente en arquitectura francesa del siglo XVIII, sino también en la obra de Richard Neutra, el arquitecto austriaco. Y uno de los capítulos más sorprendentes del libro es sobre la casa que Neutra construyó aquí en La Habana, en el Laguito. Es una casa que hizo para un banquero, Alfred DeSchultess, y es la única obra de Neutra en Cuba. Y entonces, bueno, Sylvia, con todo su conocimiento experto sobre Neutra, encontró una manera de contar cómo ese interés que tenía Neutra en el psicoanálisis, por ejemplo, él había nacido en Viena, había conocido a Sigmund Freud, después se trasladó a Los Ángeles, y cuando hace este proyecto en Cuba, él trae todo ese conocimiento a La Habana. Entonces, bueno, quería invitar a Sylvia que nos presente su trabajo en inglés. Las presentaciones hoy serán en inglés y después tendremos la oportunidad de conversar en español, en inglés, en serbocroata, si quieren, en cualquier idioma. Bueno, Sylvia, bienvenida.
I'm sorry I have to do this in English, but thank you very much, Ruben, for organizing this, and thank you to everybody for coming and for showing us such a wonderful time here. So I've been asked to be brief, so I'll get started. So as Ruben mentioned, Richard Neutra was an Austrian-born architect who came to the United States after World War I, and eventually became extremely well known in sort of 2 phases. The first phase was after the international style exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, which this house, the Level Health House, in which this house was featured. But when he became famous, he told 2 stories about how he became an architect. So the first story involved remembering being an infant and crawling underneath his kitchen table and finding comfort between the 4 legs of the table, licking the surfaces of the legs, ingesting architecture, and feeling as though he was somehow back home. The second moment he realized he was going to become an architect was when he was taken into the city by his father. So the first one is rather maternal image, if you will. And the second one was when he was taken by his father to visit the newly constructed metro in Vienna, when he was equally overtaken by the sense of technological splendor that surrounded him. So this is to say, he became an architect in his imagination by virtue of 2 forms of movement. One, as an infant, crawling under the table to return to the mother, and the second being swept up in the masculine forces of modernity underneath the city going at high speeds. And he essentially spent the rest of his life trying to figure out how architecture could manage these 2 conditions. So he came to the United States after having served in World War I, for the Anschluss in the 20s. And one direction he ultimately took was to become a technical expert. In other words, to become the architect, let's say, of that metro station that he had seen first as a young person. So he became very interested in building technology. And in fact, there are these fascinating series of photographs of him at that first house I showed you. It's the first house built with a steel frame, first residential building with a steel frame, first building using gunite. There are all kinds of technical firsts. But he loved to have photographs of himself showing people the foundations. So really embedding himself, let's say, in the underground, the technical expertise of the underground. The second thing that he did was design the kitchen table, the one that he had had these fantasies about as an infant. But if you remember when I first showed you the table, it was standing up on 4 legs, and now you see the table has literally crawled down. He called it the camel table. So the table collapsed on him to recoup this sense of being contained under the table. The fact that it's a camel is another story which I will not bother you with right today, but it's an interesting one. In any case, by the time of the period right after World War II, he had become a sort of internationally recognized celebrity on the basis of his promise that he would unite these two aspects of modernity. The alienated subject that needed to return to animality and the mother, and the masculine modernist subject that was really enjoyed being overwhelmed, let's say, by modern technology. So he became an expert in both of these, and became well known for this series of houses in which his technical expertise in terms of psychoanalysis came to the fore. As Ruben already told you, when he was in Vienna, he was always in the Freud households, and he became in particular a devotee of 2 of Freud's followers. One was Wilhelm Reich, who was a theorist of the libido, and the other was Otto Rank, who was a theorist of the birth trauma. So with respect to Wilhelm Reich, Reich believed that essentially what we would call static electricity was in fact elemental libido, and that what you needed to do to increase your creative energy was to capture the electrical energies in the air, which you could do by sitting in a box made out of wood and metal that would attract the electricity in the air and transmit it to you on the interior. So he built houses out of wood and metal, and he imagined them as orgone boxes so that the people in them would capture this energy. And he believed in this as a fundamental sort of medical gift. The woman of this house had tried for many years to become pregnant. And so this house was, she had him design this house in order to help her become pregnant. Didn't work, but you know, hope springs eternal. This is another house also in Los Angeles for a woman with a slightly different kind of problem. She had had a traumatic childhood, a traumatic relationship with her mother. And so this is a house in which is the principle of what he called the spider leg. Spiders, he had learned from these Freudian analysts, terrified children. And the thought was that they were frightening to children because they could go back into the ground, which is to say they could disappear into the body of the earth in a way that humans could not. So this triggered a kind of anxiety of having to let go of your mother. And he decided that what houses could do is help individuals overcome what was called the birth trauma. So he developed this way of carrying the structure of the house out to the exterior and down into the ground like the leg of a spider, and that living in the house would be an opportunity to take control of the birth trauma, because you could go inside and outside and repeat this traumatic separation, but this time without trauma, but with the control of repetition. So the woman of this house, in fact, eventually moved her bed from the bedroom into the living room and spent more or less the rest of her life in an analytic position, lying on the bed, watching the window, which is to say, watching her birth trauma be recuperated. So this was sort of one promise that he made to particularly American population. And another promise that he made to maybe not the American population directly, but to the American state, came when he was hired by the State Department to go around, in effect, what was becoming the American empire, both territorially and in terms of spheres of influence. So he went around Cambodia, Thailand, and a lot in Central and Latin America, the Philippines, some Samoa, all kinds of places, then down to Brazil, where in which countries or for which countries he wrote what became a very important book, The Architecture of Social Concern, in which he sought to fight or help the United States government fight what he called, I apologize, this is Neutra speaking, conducting a guerrilla warfare against backwardness. So architecture was to be the weapon in this guerrilla warfare, and it focused on things like health centers and schools, and above all on technical drawings like this. So this is the other Neutra, the technical Neutra. And he became interested not in managing airflow, if you look at all of these details, not to make people comfortable, but essentially to make what he considered to be a lethargic agricultural community better able to engage in the productive life of a rigorously modern society. So the idea was that he was going to cool the temperature down to make people in the tropics more productive capitalists, let's say. And for this, what he required was not the mother's body and trauma and so forth, but a series of specifications, that he called it a Bible of specifications, to learn how to use passive temperature control. So it's all about, if you see here as we turn to the DeSchultess house, very much about passive cooling under the roof, through a transom, over structure, in order to produce this effect. So this is all to say that he organized the world into two parts that would very soon thereafter be described as the first world and the third world. In the first world, you needed psychic assuagement, and in the third world, you needed temperature control. The two conditions are very close, but in many ways, they organized the world into a set of oppositions. And then there came Cuba. So he had been to Cuba as part of the State Department journeys in the 1940s, and focusing, there's a series of drawings that he did of old Havana. But he finally got a job in Cuba when Alfred DeSchultess, a Swiss banker, asked him to design a house in the 1950s. This was a married man with 3 daughters, and at first glance, this bar building looks like it has a lot in common with the two typologies of first world and third world architecture. But I hope to spend my last couple of minutes showing how Cuba actually turned out to be the rule that made this rule of world order collapse. So the more closely you look at it, you see that it starts to be less a compromise between these two rules and the exposing that Cuba performed of the fact that these two worlds were in fact in a category crisis. So when he came to Cuba the second time, he found not rural subjects, but of course a very sophisticated set of highly trained architects. So this was already completely unsettling to him. This was not what he expected. Then there came the site that DeSchultess had purchased. So he was imagining old Havana that looked like this. And what he found instead was a real estate development modeled on an American-style country club for luxurious and private houses that was separated not only by distance but by landscaping and so forth from the things that we might associate with Cuban life. If you see the red square in the upper right of the slide, he actually purchased 2 lots side by side. So as if one wasn't enough, he bought 2. The real estate developer guaranteed that land in Cuba was the thing that would provide the most permanent form of investment, return on your investment. They lived here for 3 years, so it was a very short-term, permanent future. This site was very troubling. Neutra had worked with Burle Marx, the Brazilian landscape architect before, and he invited him to participate, and they imagined doing one of these fancy organic gardens. But instead, when they actually got to the site, what they found was a highly flat, I would call it a real estate plot, not a landscape. All of these numbered trees was a way to communicate with Burle Marx about which trees should be cut down in order to maximize the buildable size of the lot. You can see maybe in the plan on the upper left that almost half of the landscape was actually taken up in very bourgeois programs, croquets and swimming pools and tennis courts and so forth. And for Burle Marx, a huge percentage of the land was required to be a lawn, which is not typical of his landscape design, and instead maybe we could call it the key signifier of the American suburb. So in the middle of this Cuban country club, you really had to have a sort of American landscape. So just as the real estate on which the house was constructed was simultaneously on Cuba, but actually in the deterritorialized space of the so-called First World, the house is also a study in the irresolution of Neutra's First and Third World architectures. So if you look at the bottom floor, if you look here in the plan on the right, the bottom floor is an open plan, as you would expect in a good modernist house. But if you look on the left, which is where the bedrooms are, they're a series of small rooms, very closed off, separated from the rest of the house. The house is organized in extremely gendered terms, so men to the top, women to the bottom, servants to the right, owners to the left. So the house itself tries to compose within it a kind of first and third world around gender and class. Unlike all of his houses, not all of them, but most of his other houses, the plan is super formal, U-shaped like a French hotel, so to speak, rather than what we normally think of as a modernist free plan. Not only is the plan very formal and rigid, in fact, the house is built something like a fortress, massive stone walls, no views to the exterior. The owner was extremely concerned about security, many letters between them about how to keep prying eyes out, how to keep people out, and so forth. So unlike those other houses that I showed you that are open to the landscape, this house is more like the spider blocked down, as you can see here. So most visible, I'm going to finish by looking at the two items that were key, one to his logic of specifications for the First World, and the other that was key to his logic of psychoanalytic liberation that was central to the First World, and that is the way air conditioning is treated and the way the spider legs are treated. So here are the spider legs in the DeSchultess house. They've been remade. They didn't last in their current form. But I hope you notice right away, there's no inside and outside in these spider legs, right? So they make no transition to anything. Instead, they make a formal kind of enfilade, porte cochere, and in fact, they lead absolutely nowhere except to a blank front door. So it's the opposite, so to speak, of a spider leg therapy. It's a kind of repetition, if you will, of the birth trauma. Some people are in and some people are out. Even though the issue of specifications and about being in the tropics and having passive cooling and so forth is so central to Neutra's view of what the quote-unquote third world needs, in this house, if you see the drawings, maybe you can read the writing on the left, it was air-conditioned from the beginning. So in the 1950s, air conditioning was actually pretty rare, even in the so-called First World. But there, out in the country club, somehow what was, quote, natural to the space was to have an air-conditioned interior, sealed to the outside, barricaded off from Cuba. This is an aside, just because it's amusing. He had a really wonderful local architect, Raul Alvarez, who was trained in the United States. They ended up not on speaking terms, which if anybody wants to know why, I can tell you. But at any rate, Neutra wanted the spider legs out of steel. It was too expensive, so they planned to make them out of wood. And Raoul told them the wood is going to decay in a year. You can't possibly do that. So they decided to use the paint for Chevy cars. This was Raoul's suggestion, to paint the building like a car. I think it's so very, very clever. But the point is that the paint was made like an American car, which is also battened down against the landscape, doing very, very little, if you will. So to conclude, Alvarez and Neutra fought over everything. Neutra thought he had too many opinions, didn't follow the Bible. You know, Bibles are no good if you don't follow them. His specification book was to be followed like a Bible. Didn't work. DeSchultess was extremely unhappy in the house during the 3 years that he was there, complained bitterly that the house, he had arrived to the house not neurotic, but that living in the house made him neurotic because everything about him got on his nerves. So I will conclude by quoting to you what Neutra wrote to his client about what the solution would be. He told DeSchultess that eventually his unconscious would learn to deal with the irritations of Cuba. Eventually, distracting, and I'm quoting now, eventually everything distracting, every trace of the world will disappear, even property lines. Everything belongs to you, up to the distant clouds as far as the eye reaches. Which is to say, the only way to resolve the category confusion of first world and third world was to make Cuba disappear, because Cuba was the rule that undid the rule of this planetary order that was the American fantasy.
Ahora quisiera presentar a Mark Wigley, que es un historiador y teórico de la arquitectura moderna importantísimo. Es profesor en Columbia, exdecano de la Facultad de Arquitectura de Columbia University, y ha publicado muchísimo sobre la arquitectura moderna. Mencionaré solo algunos de sus libros. Un libro precioso que se llama Muros blancos vestidos de diseñador. Y la idea de ese libro es que los muros y la pintura que se pone sobre los muros de la casa es como el vestido que se le pone a una construcción. Entonces él hace toda una relación entre la pintura y el vestido que es muy poética, muy linda. Es también autor de un libro muy importante sobre la arquitectura de la deconstrucción, y en años más recientes ha publicado, junto con Beatriz Colomina, un libro que se publicó primero en inglés y después en español en Arquine, que se llama Somos humanos, signo de interrogación. Es decir, la pregunta de si somos humanos o no. Y el último proyecto, que quizá nos contarán un poco después, en que están colaborando Mark Wigley y Beatriz Colomina, es un proyecto de investigación sobre la relación de la arquitectura moderna con las bacterias. Pero bueno, para este libro, Mark decidió estudiar un edificio que todos ustedes conocen, a diferencia de la Casa DeSchultess. Este es un edificio que todo cubano conoce y pasa frente a él una o dos veces al día, y este es el edificio Girón en el Malecón. Es uno de los edificios más mal queridos de La Habana. Como ustedes saben, yo creo que pueden recordar todo lo que se ha dicho en la calle sobre el edificio Girón, y Mark encontró una historia preciosa que nos hace aprender a querer a este edificio mal querido. Entonces, Mark, bienvenido.
Gracias, Ruben. So again, sorry for the English, but actually, if you don't hear me so well, probably that's good. Because Beatrice and I come to Cuba every few years, but we come to be educated. So I don't speak to you like a teacher, like I know anything about this building. I know some things. And if you don't hear me so well, better, right? Because the question is, what can we learn from this building? This is a building you know super well, you know better than me. But buildings are strange. I mean, the relationship between humans and buildings is as strange as the relationship between humans. That means really very strange. So you think you know this building, but I don't know. This picture, by the way, this is the first image in the Museum of Modern Art exhibition of Latin America in construction. So this is a very, very big book. It's the Museum of Modern Art. It's super official. You can hear the music playing, official, official, official. This is the first image you see. So this is kind of like the facade of Latin America in construction. Right? But what's fascinating to me is the book does not discuss this building. So the facade of Latin America, like the part of Latin America that's, let's say, facing New York, is this building. But let's not talk about this building. And by the way, in this building, you don't really see what's behind it. I certainly don't see Havana. So it's a very particular way of making this picture. You know, of course, if you make the same picture today, it's a very different scene, and you will see a new Havana, quite ugly, let's say, in the foreground. So how is it that there can be a building that is the most important building to represent an entire project about Latin America? Let's say we pretend for a moment there is such a thing as Latin America. That would sound like something like America after the Spanish. So maybe this means also Brazil is not there. So not necessarily Portuguese. Right? So very, very strange. And yet we don't talk about it. So I'm very interested in a building which is everybody knows, everybody thinks about, and nobody talks about. And I don't know how you feel about it, but I think it's also true in Cuba that nobody talks about the building. I mean, the Girón, sure. But to understand, is it good or bad? I know it's complicated, but the building is, let's say, more familiar like this. So it's the ruin of something. I mean, interesting, the MoMA image is kind of perfect. It's not so perfect. This is the Girón you know. Also the one you know more recently. Right? I love this photograph because the bad hotel is evaporated, and we see a building in danger being protected by these beautiful trucks. So how to talk about this building? A building that is on Malecón, is literally facing New York. It's literally the facade. It literally presents itself as a wall. Was the tallest building on Malecón for a long time, facing the enemy. Right? It obviously was a political building, a building for the revolution, of the revolution, that makes a statement back towards, let's say, the world of capitalism and so on and so on. You know the movie, you can play the music, but what is that statement? Like what is exactly that statement? And I would say there are several ways we can think about this. We can think about revolution, we can think about Cuba, the history of Cuba, we can think about the Cold War, the super hot war, we can think about all these things. But usually we think that buildings sit on the ground. And I'm not so sure that a building on Malecón is on the ground. After all, Malecón was a colonial project, right? Was a piece of architecture, was a kind of construction, was very much a construction of, let's say, the north in the south, very much part of conquering and diminishing and demeaning the south. Even the idea that this building faces the north is not typical of historical Cuba, which was not so interested in the ocean, right? Havana itself is precisely not a city that looks to the water. So if this building sits on Malecón, well, it's not exactly sitting on Cuba, it's sitting on the invaded Cuba. And of course, not possible to think of this building without thinking of the American embassy on the same, occupying the same territory. And clearly this building is meant to be in some kind of conversation with the American embassy. But still, I think if we think of this building as being, let's say, on the ground, it's normally the way we think of buildings, right? Being on the ground. And now we think maybe this ground is not Cuban ground, or is a violated Cuban ground, or is a space of negotiation between Cuba and the outside. And by the way, I'm not sure there's such a thing as the real Cuba invaded by the other. Maybe all of us, we are only ourselves in the way we react to various invasions. I presume that you are breathing tonight. it's a good idea to breathe, but you are basically bringing the outside world in, and you are deciding which part of that world to keep and which part of that to remove. So probably Cuba, if there is such a thing as Cuba, is a kind of organism which is taking things from the world and deciding some things are useful and some things are not. And when it does that, it changes the world. So it's not simply Cuba, vulnerable, small, fragile, in the middle of the ocean, reacting to the world. Probably the world is reacting to Cuba in the same way. So for me, more interesting to think of buildings not coming from the ground, but actually coming from the air. After all, Cuba was a kind of idea of radio. You know, like this is 1904. This is a plan for radio stations you see in Panama, in Puerto Rico, in Cuba, but also in the Pacific Islands, Japan, and so on. This is a new military network of huge radio antennas that are making a kind of inversion of the map, because you could see that the Pacific Ocean, which is now a space of radio, is bigger than the United States. So now this is the idea of radio as being the real world, the world of communication, to which the land is attached. And very important to know, Cuba is a key part of this map. So 1904, 1905 is signed the contract to make the radio antennas. Here you know, of course, the original antenna near the Morro, near the castle. So this is an antenna that's talking to another antenna. This was made by a guy called DeSchultess, which is a great radio person. He makes 1 month later the radio antenna in Guantanamo. So again, military occupation. And this then becomes part of this global network. Very much the Americans are arriving with radio, and the independence for Cuba will be understood as radio, as a kind of counter-radio project. The story of Cuba is very much a story of radio. You see here kind of typical scene of a postcard, and you see in the distance the antenna of the Morro. Radio antennas are much bigger than buildings and much more important than buildings. In fact, those buildings only have meaning because there could be this possibility of communication to the world. So what if just for this moment, and it would be better for me that you had some mojitos before I say this, but imagine you have had another 5 mojitos, and then I tell you buildings are not so much coming up from the ground, but are actually hanging down from the world of radio. You show me a building without a radio antenna, and it's a miracle. You show me a human without radio antennas. Each of you in your pocket have 4 or 5 radio antennas connecting you to the world. So isn't it possible, this typical view of Melanchon, you see in the distance the tower in El Morro, but if you look to the right, you see 2 more huge towers. Actually, all of the historical pictures of Havana are filled with radio antennas. Here you are looking down the avenue with the Hotel Presidente, and the first radio antenna in Havana is built right on that side by Lee de Forest, and this is the first part of that kind of global network. The site of the building that is now referred to as Girón is just 1 block to the right. So this is the beginning in Verdad. So let's imagine that this is a site defined by its relationship to the world through radio, through information, through communication. Okay, maybe you know this guy. 1959, the very first time he makes a speech to a professional group, and it's the group of architects, and he says, of course, as you know, an architectural political revolution must be an architectural revolution. He makes a call for the best, most relentlessly experimental architecture, and he says specifically, should be 100 new buildings on Melanchon, exactly in this area, because this is the area occupied by the foreign rich, not accessible to the workers of Cuba. So we need 100 new buildings here, which will be the buildings of the workers, and buildings, they will occupy the site of the rich, right? That's the kind of call. So of course at some level, what you call Edificio Girón, but was always known as Edificio Experimental, was the name Girón comes very, very late, even late relative to the Bay of Pigs. This building is like a kind of radio broadcast. It's a kind of an image. It's meant to be seen from, its facade is to the United States. It's photographed by the United States. It's thought this way. It is also a very, I would say, amazing building. If we forget about Cuba, we forget about the United States, we forget about, let's say, politics, if it's possible, and we just think, okay, what kind of building this is? For a building like this, starting construction in 1965, this is a very, very progressive, interesting building. It's a system, you see here, it's a system of blocks which are linked by vertical and horizontal communication. The system can grow and can network. So this is a project you have to think about in the same way that you think about archigram, the way you think about the megastructures. It's of this type. It has a relationship to the work of the Smithsons with the streets in the sky. It has a relationship to Louis Kahn with the separation of, all the kind of references are kind of obvious. But possibly this more radical than all those examples. Like possibly this more interesting than Louis Kahn, more interesting than archigram, and so on. It has two sizes of room, can be 3-bedroom or 2-bedroom. All of the elements here can be moved. All of the elements are prefabricated. Every aspect of this building is a representation of communism in the sense of more or less socialist organization by which a simple system will be equally good for everybody and has a kind of flexibility and operation. It will be perfectly well ventilated. The horizontal communication system will not interrupt the view. So even if it's meant to be seen, let's say, from the outside, there is also the possibility of the view from the inside. And when it's first published, you see it as a model here, the model published in 1964. And I think not by accident you have a big bus passing in front, because a little bit this building is like a bus, that is to say a collective form of transportation in which everybody sits in the same kind of seat and can move together, and because they move together they are one and maybe they can sing the right song, versus the automobiles, which of course represent, let's say, the remains of the United States, and they are probably United States organized. Again, I think this building, and just for my own personal preference, this building should be in any significant history of buildings of the 20th century. I think it needs to be up there. It's a building designed by Quintana and Rodriguez. If I mention the name Quintana, maybe you want to leave the lecture, I understand. But I would invite you to consider the possibility that it may be quite hard to find a very important building that's not built by somebody that's truly horrible. It's possible. It's just possible. In which case, just for a moment, let's think about the personality. But of course, it's a very particular personality that is the assistant director of the MICON, is in charge of reconstruction of Cuba, is also one of the few architects of his generation not to leave. He's also taking over the School of Architecture, is also very much involved in a kind of censorship. So a very, very complicated figure, but a figure that is by definition aligned with the revolutionary project, even if it's hard to think of this as a revolutionary person. So here you look at a building that would in any other context, anywhere else in the world, be understood as a kind of very good representation of a kind of flexibility of capitalism and a way in which things can move, here as a kind of monument to the revolution. Even the technique of construction, basically the idea that the site becomes a factory in which the building is assembled on the factory, rising up so fast, like 1.5 meters per day, is again another utopian image of a socialist or at least communist revolution. So a building that in its technical organization, in its performance, is political, understood to be political. The same element here, which is making one floor, can move to another site and make another floor. So hypothetically, the whole of Cuba could be covered with this very, very efficiently produced object. So here we see it as it's first published in 1967. You see it's on the way up. I think never an accident that there is always a bus in the picture, and the bus is always in the same place, right? So now you have a bus which is in the same place as the model, almost like they waited to produce this image. Some of you can concentrate on how this image was photographed, but you see it's up about 4 floors. We see it published at night, so this doesn't sleep. Revolution doesn't sleep. Revolution is a revolution because it doesn't sleep. Getting taller, right? So fast. Okay, then it's first published outside of Cuba by Roberto Segre, you see on the left, in L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui, on the right, 1968. So it's 1 year later. You see in the bottom right picture that it is now taller, but maybe you can already sense a bit of a problem. This building that is supposed to come up 1.5 meters per day, which means you should be able to make the whole building in 1 week. 1 year later, they have only working on one block, and it hasn't reached the top yet, and they haven't started the second block. So maybe in the back of your mind, you're thinking there's a problem. The same model is there with the same bus. 1 year later. In that year, Fidel Castro makes a speech saying that this building is, as in his own words, amazing. I think it's one of the few times, I'm not sure the Spanish word used, but I've never heard this word from him. Maybe that means he doesn't really mean it. It's possible. So he declares that this is an absolutely extraordinary project, again alluding to the fact that the system of construction captures, let's say, the full force of the revolution in architecture that would also be political revolution. Immediately following his speech, Grandma, of course, as the official organ, makes a quick article on how amazing this project is, but you notice that they have now, so we are now already in 1969, the second tower is on the way up, but they still haven't done any of the interconnection. So this building, which is all about speed and efficiency, is unbelievably slow. It's a permanent monument on the Malecon. It's very slowly going up. And what nobody is talking about is the fact that the second block, the one on the left-hand side, was always falling over. So there was a huge technical problem, and for a long period of time it was held in position with a huge amount of cables. So there's a reason it's going slow, is that it looks like actually it's a bad idea. Meanwhile, the concept, building large towers through this technique is starting to happen all over Cuba. So what's interesting is that this building represents a technique that it fails at, but it represents a technique that's more or less successful everywhere else. So again, I'm trying to suggest to you this building is basically a kind of media performance. Of course it's a building, and nobody's living in there because it's never finished. Actually, it doesn't matter that it's not finished, because what matters is it represents a kind of an idea about building. It's not finished. A year later, already starting to become beautiful, and for me, tis a beautiful building. You can see still working on it. It is once again the main image for an article devoted to the new tall towers everywhere in Cuba. Again, it's unfinished, and inside are many towers that are finished. A year later again, they return to a previous image. So actually they prefer the building when it was earlier to publish. Eventually, 1976, Bohemia will publish the building like this, and for the first time you see it in context, and maybe we could imagine that it's finished. I'm not sure, but it's possible that people are now for the first time living in this building 10 years after construction was begun. I finished just by quickly following you through the thing about Segre, right? Segre publishes this in L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui in an issue on the Third World. So it's really a kind of non-alignment argument that includes this building as a very important representative of kind of counter-cultural operations. Again, probably you know all of Segre's book, but the building keeps reappearing. It's always the same drawing, the same model, and a slightly different version of when it's constructed. The building even goes backwards again, right? So we're really moving through time. We're moving now through decades. Now we're up to 1980, and we, for the first time, 1980, see the building more or less, as it were, finished. Even in 82, he shows this image, very strange, as if Havana is somehow, it's like in a desert, like in Nevada, very strange. And then finally, he publishes the only image I know in which you can see all the wires that are stopping the building from falling over. And as you can imagine, the possibility that this building is falling over is not part of the speeches of Grandma or Fidel or Cuba Constructed. This is a deep kind of embarrassment, because these wires are going deep back into Vedado to hold this building in place. Anyway, they eventually sort out the problem. Of course, Segre doesn't refer to the wires in the image. He's probably right, you know. probably we have every reason to think that somebody reading an architectural book doesn't look at the images. Right? Because if you can tell a good story, why look at the images? Right? 84, he publishes the image again. 85, and we could keep going. In this moment, this one I think is 84, this photograph, like many of the photographs that Segre publishes, and of course I refer to Segre because he's the official architectural historian of revolutionary architecture, right? Obviously. And this is his own photograph, taken from the rear. So for the first time we really see the building conveyed to us, let's say, as it might be understood from the point of view of Cuba. The thing is that Segre, when he arrives in Cuba in 1963, he starts to teach, and it is a requirement of teachers that they also work. So even if he's really a historian, he also should work. And his job was to work on details of this building. So every time he publishes this building, he's publishing exactly the building which was the beginning of his own experience of being a kind of revolutionary theorist or theorist of the revolution. And his job, while he was writing his first book, 10 Years of the Architectural Revolution, his job was to check the prefabrication of all the elements of this building. So this building is deeply built into Roberto Segre's, let's say, sort of genealogy. By the way, the building where he writes that book is on the site of the very first radio station in Havana, the very same site. And when he's publishing this building for the first time, he presents a kind of theory of architecture as a form of media. And he's very influenced by this kind of concept. So I think that Segre is fully aware that this building is a kind of performance, which is not a performance about the workers or the actual workers, but it's a kind of, let's say, theater. And by the way, if it's theater, that sounds fantastic. Without theater, I think we will be nothing. So this is something very crucial. So these are just a few thoughts for this building, which of course is in a more sad condition today. But, and I don't think I have offered you so much tonight, but I think it is a building very, very extraordinary in its formation, in its kind of concept. And I think the fact that people find it difficult to talk about it, like talking about your parents might be difficult, for me makes it a bit more interesting. So I think the work must continue. And of course I refer to Segre, who is fading in our minds like the building is fading, because they are together. They're not separable. When you look at this image, you must, in my opinion, see Roberto Segre. You must also see the early years of the revolution and the complicated relationship it develops with architecture. And this building is uncomfortable because it could be pushed back into the time of the buildings before the revolution, in which of course Quintana was one of the main architects. It can also be pushed a little bit forward in time and then seen as a kind of victim of a kind of a Soviet model of what a prefabrication could be. But it also could be simply treasured as an attempt to make prefabrication a more kind of, let's say, utopian potential. So for me, once again, the idea that this building is basically kind of hanging on the ground, and I don't know when is the last time you saw it, but don't you think it's possible that one day you walk down the Malecon and it's gone? Like your parents. One day they are gone. And so I think it might be good to take another look. Thank you.
Gracias, Marc. Y bueno, yo creo que ahora todos vamos a pensar en el Girón de otra manera y lo vamos a ver con una mirada fresca. Ya no va a ser el edificio malquerido del Malecón. Hemos estado hablando mucho de Freud y del psicoanálisis desde nuestra primera presentación sobre Richard Neutra, ahora con esta lectura también freudiana desde otro punto de vista del edificio Girón. Y yo creo que una de las cosas de la teoría de Freud es que Freud insistía en que hay que hablar de lo que nadie habla. Hay que mirar lo que nadie quiere mirar y hay que pensar lo que nadie quiere pensar. Y hay otro ejemplo, digamos, de este punto ciego en la arquitectura de La Habana, y otro gran ejemplo es la Embajada Rusa, otro edificio mal querido. ¿Cuánta gente no ha dicho una daga clavada en el corazón de La Habana, una jeringuilla clavada en el corazón de La Habana? Y lo interesante es que este edificio no ha sido analizado ni por los cubanos ni por los rusos. Hay un rechazo muy fuerte de ambas partes. Es un poco como lo que pasó con Soy Cuba, la película de Calata sobre el 64, que fue un gran fracaso tanto en La Habana como en Moscú. Y entonces tuvimos la suerte, cuando Beatriz y yo hicimos este seminario, de tener con nosotros a Darja Filippova, que es la persona perfecta para estudiar este edificio por varias razones. Primero es que Darja nació en un país que ya no existe, que es la Unión Soviética, en Estonia, y entonces, bueno, tenía, digamos, los idiomas para empezar, podía leer los archivos en ruso, las revistas en ruso, las publicaciones en ruso, para tratar de entender un poco la historia de esta embajada, primero soviética, después rusa. Bueno, para decirles algo sobre Darja, bueno, Darja, además de haber nacido en este país ahora inexistente, es doctora por la Universidad de Princeton, tiene un doctorado en literatura comparada, con una tesis apasionante sobre el cuerpo descorporalizado y la historia del performance en el mundo postsoviético. Y entonces, bueno, hoy Darja nos va a hablar de su investigación sobre la embajada rusa. Bienvenida.
Hello, everybody. It's a very hot evening. So my name is Darja. It's a pleasure to be here. And indeed, I am speaking about this blind spot that is both extremely visible and yet somehow invisible at the same time. And I will speak to you about architecture of revolutionary belatedness, and focusing on the USSR, now Russian embassy in Havana. And this project is a continuation of my work, which is about a rethinking of post-socialism. So I'm interested in thinking about what is post-socialism and thinking against this idea of post-socialism as something that is just belated or late to incorporate into a kind of a capitalist future, and instead of post-socialism as a place that digests the socialist past in maybe a new way, and how this digestion itself can produce, be haunted by the incomplete project of utopia, or maybe it can digest in a way that produces something entirely new, or how this misdigestion and digestion and the cycle kind of, what does it shit out and what becomes nutritious. And this project was really inspired by the trip that was taken to Havana, and this story is really part of the engagement with the work. We were on a trip to, as Ruben said, in 2017 to Havana, and during this trip, we visited both the Soviet embassy and the American embassy on the same day. And of course these buildings face each other because they're both part of a kind of architecture of diplomacy that is also very much part of the Cold War. But there has been much written about the American embassy, and almost nothing has been written about the Soviet one. And this year, 2017, is also an important year because it was the 100-year anniversary of the October Soviet Revolution. So when I was coming to Cuba, I was coming with thinking about the 100-year anniversary and visiting this very strange building on that year seemed important. And the project really came into being through a very through a very maybe strange but very poignant conversation with the assistant to the consul during the tour to the building, in which when asked if he had been to the upper floors, and now let's see the upper floors, these upper floors, this rectangular structure at the top, right, that looks like a set of eyes watching over Havana. He said that,
You'll come back in a few minutes.
Maybe I can just continue talking.
Yeah, continue.
He said that he has no idea. He had never gone up there. He just thinks it's a set of disconnected cables. So I pictured this sort of building that is haunted by these. What are these cables connected to? What are the dreams and nightmares and fantasies that they have carried all the way from the Soviet Union and plunged them into this island? And so the project was really about excavating these dreams and that animate the structure. So the structure is also, from my understanding, not very beloved, but subject of a lot of conversation. So it's a kind of, does it look like a sword that's stuck into the island, or is it like a syringe sucking out its blood? Or is it some sort of robot? I know Los Carpinteros made a work about the embassy where they were talking about this absolutely useless object. And kind of making it useful by making a replica as an armoire, like a cupboard. So this art group, Los Carpinteros, they made it into this thing that had you could open all the little compartments. They also made a replica out of Lego. So this object has been really part of many imaginaries, partially because there's just so little information about it. The information, there's not really an archive you can visit to get anything about, because it's classified, because it's a functioning embassy. So what I started to explore is this idea of revolutionary belatedness, that there's something about the embassy that is entirely out of time, or is like between two times that never met. That there's something about the temporality of the Soviet Revolution and the Cuban Revolution that kind of are sort of miss each other. And this embassy is something that was this grandiose project that was, by the moment it had arrived, it already became a certain expired ruin in a way. Because it opened in 1987, but 1987 was just a few years before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So by the time the embassy project was conceived 10 years prior, during kind of good relationships between the USSR and Cuba, under Leonid Brezhnev also visited the island in 1985, and there was a momentous occasion, and I think a lot of bilateral agreements were signed. And also there was, although it was a wonderful kind of occasion, it also resulted in a deep economic dependency of Cuba on the Soviet Union. But by the time that the embassy opened, the relationship was quite bad, actually potentially just very bad, between with Gorbachev's notion of perestroika. And then when the Soviet embassy collapses altogether, the Soviet Union collapses, but the Soviet embassy remains, it creates a very negative connotation, because the embassy, the withdrawal of Soviet aid to Cuba is partially responsible for a deep economic crisis in the 1990s, right? And so essentially this enormous building kind of watches over the economic ruin and the ruin of a lot of architectural buildings as it kind of remains standing as one of the tallest buildings on the island, and also incidentally probably the tallest embassy in the world. So there's something very odd here and mismatched about kind of what kind of it aspired to, and by the moment that it arrived, it could never already represent. So, and I guess I cannot show you any images, but there is.
You could turn the computer around and
Oh.
show the screen.
Oh, do you?
Let's just wait until.
Or can people see the screen?
Oh. Yes. So there is. So the embassy, when you start to dig a little bit, the embassy is not totally unrelated to other Soviet projects at the time. So although it is not a very diplomatic structure, because many times an embassy would maybe have something more to do with potential local architecture, for example. There's generally some desire to ideally, I suppose, reflect the local environment. So the embassy clearly does not reflect any local style, but it is made out of, it was a bilateral agreement, so the architectural project was agreed upon bilaterally. And it was also, the exterior is made of Cuban porous limestone, and the interior is made out of also local marble. So the materials were very much local. And the embassy also has like styles that are a little bit composed of slightly different temporalities. So this rectangular structure on top is very much echoes to 1920s constructivist designs. And then, sorry, we still have no capacity to show?
It'll come back.
Okay. Whereas the experimentation of the building is very much a part of a 1970s trend of Soviet architecture that created these very futuristic or utopian but highly monumental concrete structures in its satellite states. So in a way, it's very interesting how this utopian future imaginary is already exiled outside of the Soviet Union into these kind of, from the perspective of the Soviet Union, faraway places. But what is most interesting about it is, of course, its height. And I became very kind of most, I guess, turned on by this very large shape by thinking about its relationship to what are known as the Moscow high-rise buildings. They're called Vysotki, which are in Moscow a series of, I guess they could be called like skyscrapers, because these were made by an order from Stalin in the order came in the 1940s to create something in the Soviet Union that would parallel the skyscrapers in New York. So these 7 buildings were designed in the 1940s by the architect Polikov, so the 2 architects who designed the embassy in Cuba are Alexandr Rochegov and Maria Engelke. They're a couple. Alexandr Rochegov is mostly associated with the embassy. His name is official in the embassy. But Maria Engelke, his wife, is also a very important part of this because they collaborate on a series of projects. And while he designed I suppose the exterior, she did all of the interior design of the embassy. And so back to these, the height of the building and its relationship to other, these buildings in Moscow, these high-rises in Moscow that are called the Seven Sisters. So these high-rises in Moscow are the foundation. They were very important as kind of also Cold War era competition for dominance and the representation of a kind of dominance with height. Okay. Alexandr Rochegov and Maria Engelke initially came to, they were Soviet architects that were educated in the school in Leningrad. And then they moved, and then they worked on a series of state projects. Maria Engelke did a lot of design for 2 metro stations in Moscow and a lot of other state interior spaces. And Rochegov, he designed a series of important buildings, among which, I think this is good, just like this. Among which is, so this is Maria Engelke and Alexandr Rochegov. They were born in 1917 and 1918 respectively, so really marked by the Soviet Revolution. So when they move, so this is one of Maria Engelke's interior designs. This is the metro station Arbatskaya in Moscow. And when they came to, initially came to Moscow, they came to Moscow to work for this architect. One second. And this is a very small image over here. Can you see it? The one on the right? They came to work with with Leonid Polyakov, who was a very important architect that was at the time working on this very utopian proposal of the Palace of the Soviets. So the Palace of the Soviets was this a kind of representation of a certain utopian dream that was never realized, that a series of very visionary architects worked on, including Polyakov, who became the mentor of Rochegov and Engelke, for the work on this Leningradskaya hotel. So Leningradskaya hotel is one, in this image over here, is one of these high-rises in Moscow. So these high-rises of Moscow, as I said, were part of this Cold War era competition between the United States and Stalin's Soviet Union. And the foundation of all the 7 buildings was laid on the same day in 1947. So 7 foundations were laid to build, actually 8 foundations were laid, but only 7 buildings were constructed, Leningradskaya Hotel being one of them, and this Palace of the Soviets I told you about, for which in the background of this image on the upper right, you see, can I make it bigger somehow? So, this Palace of the Soviets design was never realized, although the foundation for it was laid. And when Rochegov and Engelke start to work under the mentorship of this Polyakov architect, they work first on the Leningradskaya Hotel, and Rochegov works on the facade, and Engelke works on the interior. The interior of the Leningradskaya Hotel is quite extraordinary. It's now it has become the Leningradskaya Hilton Hotel, which is predictable, but still funny. And this sort of outside, inside in a way, I think there is a very strong relationship between Leningradska, which was a very important project for Engelke and Rochegov, and the Soviet embassy. For example, in the first sketches of the Soviet embassy, it was actually without that rectangular structure on top, as you see also here. So there's sort of a very interesting relationship to these Moscow high-rises. And I think ultimately in this paper and like the project, what I'm really trying to imagine in a way is that could it be that there is, because of this revolutionary belatedness, in the sense that why in the 1970s they were kind of trying to design a building in Cuba that in a way echoed to the 1920s, which was a very revolutionary moment, and also incorporates elements of this 1940s, 1950s American USSR cold race over high-rises. So it takes from 1920s, it takes from the high-rise, and also it takes from the fact that in the 1970s, in the Soviet Union, the revolutionary project was already in a way, it was changing. It was no longer ignited by the same sort of like revolutionary fervor. And was it possible that already at this time, Rochegov and Engelke were in a way imagining, in a very problematic way, on Cuba to be a kind of place where you can export these dreams and leave them here as if in a crypt. And the embassy, with all these cables that no one has ever been to and no one has ever seen, like when I look at this design, for example, for a 350-seat auditorium, has anyone sat in this 350-seat auditorium? I don't know. And so I was thinking, I started to think about the embassy as a kind of completion or a deferral of this incomplete foundation for the palace, this 8th project that was never built, the foundation for which was laid. And is it possible that there's a kind of revolutionarily belated exportation for something to be open maybe in the future or in the past or maybe never? And there's a kind of a crypt of all of these fantasies and desires that were already not actual in the Soviet Union, but with the potential to somehow actualize them elsewhere. Like to drop something into an almost different time, to be read in a new way. And it's also part of this is also that the embassy building, we have the tower, but the embassy compound itself is enormous. And it really, when Rochegov in an interview, when he was asked about why build what were you thinking with this building, he said, I really want to create a microcosm of the Soviet Union. And so this building, there's, apart from this enormous structure, it's 4 hectares. And there's a volleyball court, like there's all of these, there's a full capacity to sustain life almost on this compound. And on the interior is also quite interesting because the interior, and here we have an image on the right, does not reflect any kind of relationship to Cuba at all, but there is an internal design element that mimics the external facade. For example, the chandeliers are custom made, obviously, and are the embassy hanging upside down. Then there's this enormous mosaic of Lenin, and then the images, the artwork on the wall, is also very significant. It is actually mostly images of snow-covered forests with bears frolicking among them. So it's also a question of what is preserved in this crypt as it arrives on this island. It is images of bears frolicking in snow-covered forests. And also another room, and I don't have an image here, is designed, made by the architect's daughter in its frescoes of female representations of the Soviet republics dancing together. This is another image of this internal, really beautiful stained glass window. And this is on the right, Los Carpintieros version of the embassy as a armoire, as a cabinet. So, yes, I just want to restate what I said, and maybe I just read here a paragraph and then I will end. That the Soviet embassy connotes an architecture of revolutionary belatedness. Belatedness as in coming too late. In this case, speaks to an architectural form that was meant for the utopic future of the world socialism as what it was imagined in the 1970s, and yet the embassy being inaugurated in 1987 at the height of perestroika following the Cuban rectification of era's campaign, it came too late for both the USSR and Cuba. So the experimental design of the embassy can be seen as a testament of Engelke and Rochegov's mature collective vision of Soviet architecture, and read as a representation of the Soviet Union at the time, that one that was built on a series of deferred dreams. So each of these dreams is also architecturally coded. And almost I see this structure as this architecturally coded dreams of the interior and the exterior, these snow frolicking bears, and these image elements of constructivism and elements of the Hotel Leningradska, all together serving as this kind of crypt to be transposed here as the Soviet Union was already kind of expiring, with the hope that the difference in the revolutionary temporality between the Soviet Union and the Cuban revolutionary temporality would potentially create another capacity to fulfill the deferred dream. Thank you.
Gracias, Daria, por esa lectura tan poética que nos demuestra que este edificio, que parece tan aislado, tan fuera de lugar en La Habana, se conecta con toda una historia transatlántica de toda una serie de debates revolucionarios que vienen de la Unión Soviética, y además el papel de la pintora, de María Rochegov, es interesantísimo, que ella fue una pintora, arquitecta, decoradora, y en la embajada soviética, en Editorial, hay varias de las pinturas que estudia Daria en su capítulo también. Muchas gracias. Bueno, después de los rusos, los americanos. Y ahora quería presentar al artista canadiense Terence Gower, que ha trabajado muchísimo sobre arquitectura moderna, ha hecho varios proyectos sobre la historia de la arquitectura moderna en México, sobre la arquitectura de Luis Barragán, y desde hace años está elaborando una serie de investigaciones sobre la arquitectura de las embajadas americanas en sitios de conflicto. Y entonces uno de los ejemplos es Bagdad, la embajada americana en Bagdad, y otro es la embajada americana en La Habana, que se terminó de construir a mediados de los 50 y después fue el sitio de una serie de conflictos. Bueno, Terence Gower es artista canadiense, vive en Nueva York, ha tenido muchas exposiciones. Mencionaré solamente las últimas: una exposición monográfica en el Power Plant de Toronto, que se presentó en diciembre del año pasado, y la última es en la Galería del Marais en París, que se inauguró hace unas semanas y está todavía ahí. Bueno, bienvenido, Terence.
So
I'm sorry it's so late, but I think it's important to give this talk now. Following the Soviet embassy, I'm going to talk about the US embassy in Havana. It's a long investigation for an artwork, for an art installation I'll show you. So I'll show you give you some information on the building itself and the history of the construction. And then I'll show you how that's worked into the art project itself. So I'll show you some shots of the installations I've done. The first time was 2016, and now it's been shown about 5 times in different configurations, the installation. So I think it's great to follow Mark, because talking about architecture as message, I think is absolutely appropriate to the embassies, especially this one. Actually, Danny was interesting because of this idea of the crypt and the kind of emissary from the past. It's super, super interesting idea. This is a much more active idea, I think, of the messaging in the embassy and the building. So the architecture as message. This is a perfect example. So there's been a lot of interest recently about embassy architecture as cultural diplomacy. This idea that these buildings are built as kind of what would that be, like soft diplomacy to overtures to other countries through this architecture and culture. And I think there's also obviously a commercial aspect as well. So when the U.S. builds these embassies, and this whole project focuses on the period in the 50s, 60s, going into the early 70s, which was this kind of embassy building boom, where the State Department was hiring some of the leading architects to build buildings around the world. As Ruben mentioned, I'm up to number 4 now on the embassy projects. This was number 2. So the Havana embassy was completed in 1953, and it's as much as giving us an ideal image of the U.S. That it's they started working with modern architects, so we had these sort of transparent facades. The idea was to communicate an idea of transparency in government. We have nothing to hide, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's of course the kind of virtuoso work in the actual construction of the buildings as a demonstration of U.S. know-how and of course building technology. So we have kind of the leading building technology. Come to us when you need materials and buildings, et cetera, et cetera. So it was demonstrated in the embassy. So this is a 1954 ad. So it was a year after the embassy opened, with the embassy in the background you see for this car company. So it was also obviously, we're the most modern, we're kind of forward-thinking young country in the world now after the war. This is kind of what the U.S. came to symbolize around the world. I just found this 1950s cartoon. So it's you can see it's like a mass demonstration somewhere like Baghdad, and somebody is saying he's looking for the United States Embassy, and the guy he's talking to says, "The United States Embassy? Just follow us. We're on our way there right now." And it's a riot, basically, going to the embassy to protest. So this is how the message changed, and that's what I'm going to show you some images of quickly of how the U.S., when they built the building, it was built with this very clear messaging, and then the meaning of the building changed enormously, of course, after the revolution in Cuba. The U.S. wanted to build, of course, in the most modern part of the city, so Verano. This is a photograph from the early 50s. I guess it's late 50s, sorry. In the company of obviously Foxa and these other skyscrapers. This is one of the early renderings of the embassy itself, with this kind of ideal setting on the Malecon. They had the thing was very much. It's interesting to thinking of Mark's idea of kind of facing the United States. The building sort of faced. The only part of the building actually faced the United States was that kind of blank wall you see with the balcony on the far side, which we're going to talk about in a minute. These are some construction photos I found in the archives. So a lot of my work is done especially the embassy work in the archive, the National Archives in Washington. Building under construction. It was considered quite advanced in that it had no internal columns at all in the building. That's why you have these very heavy mullions going around, and they're supporting these floor slabs that span the entire space. So no columns, no partitions, except for the elevator shafts. The functions are divided. So on that lower horizontal slab, of course, is the visa office, which a few people here may have actually been in. And then the vertical is the ambassador's office, and what would that be? Consular services, I guess. Here it is nearing completion, and of course, here's a completed picture. This is before the addition of the air conditioning floor on the top floor in the late 1980s, I think it was. Of course, what's amazing whenever I show this image to people anywhere in the world is that there are no security fences or barriers or gates or anything. And there's a military jeep there, but otherwise it's just kind of full access. You can walk right in to the embassy. So this was a part of this ideal. So this is one of their directives to the architects in all of these embassies was, we want transparency, we want access, we want people to be able to walk right into the embassy, which is the opposite of what they're doing now in embassy design. This would have been taken right after the embassy was built. These are from the archives in, actually, I didn't tell you the architect's name. It's Harris and Abramovitz was the firm. And Abramovitz was really the main architect on the project. So there you have the transparency. The top floor was originally completely open. It was like a peristyle going around this open space with the conference room that you see here. So you see how the vertical columns are the continuation of those mullions that go all the way to the roof, with the staircase going down to the floor below. Here's the ambassador's office in its original configuration that I'm not going to go into today, but there's a lot to talk about as far as the furniture and the way the building was finished on the inside, different problems. And then you see those windows on the left actually go out onto the balcony. You can see a bit of the balcony railing on the left. Here's again that transparency. This is the lobby of the embassy, believe it or not. So completely glass, sheets of glass. Anyone could sort of walk in and sit down in those Barcelona chairs. This is the visa office from the inside. This has all been covered up now. I think actually they covered over this patio and built a sort of blast wall inside the lobby, so you couldn't actually drive into there. So what I focused on two things in the project. So the way I work is I do the research, I develop an argument, a bit like a writer, and then I express it in an artwork rather than a book. Or an essay. In this case, I did write an essay, which is of course in the book that we're celebrating today. So one of the more interesting documents I found in the archive was this very long report from the State Department inspector. So each time an embassy would be built anywhere in the world, they would send an inspector to go. They'd fly them in, and they would do a detailed report on how the building is functioning, whether it's actually functioning properly and satisfying the needs of the State Department. In this case, I think it's in the second paragraph. I was caught by this because the embassy buildings are so symbolic and so representational in a way. One of the first things, we're actually on page 7 now of the report, is he complained about the balcony that I just showed you off the ambassador's office, and he described it as Mussolini style. So the U.S. being sensitive about appearing as an imperialist power, suddenly realized, thanks to the inspector, that they're actually projecting this kind of imperial image, just simply through this form. As everyone knows, everyone's of course walked by this building a million times. It's a blank facade with the ambassador's windows there, and then this balcony. Actually, the balcony was requested by an earlier ambassador as they were starting the plans for the building. He said, "Wouldn't it be great to have a balcony off my office?" And then it became kind of symbolically problematic. And so I decided to work with the form of that balcony as this kind of unwitting and kind of embarrassing, accidental signifier of U.S. imperialism on the facade of the building, kind of like the nose on the face. And I started to work with that as a sculptural form in this series of sculptures. This is actually a full-scale rendering of the balcony. It's basically a drawing in space. And the material, this is the original installation in New York, and then this is in Chicago. It's an outdoor installation. The piece is made of rebar, so cavillos, as we call it. Rusted, and one of in my many visits to Cuba and passing time here is, of course, I've noticed the incredible work of artisans, metal workers working with this material as one of the few available materials, often for furniture, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea of the piece is a little bit, okay, if we had to generate that form now under the conditions of the embargo and the scarcity of materials, what would be left to us in order to create that shape of the balcony? And this is the material. So this is a recent installation. This is a show from last year in Toronto where all of these, I think Ruben just mentioned, all of my embassy studies were brought together. This is the Havana case study. Each installation is called a case study. And so we have the sculpture, and then we have this other narrative. You see a sort of vitrine in the back and these series of collages on the wall. And I'll show you what those are made up of. So of course, the 1953, the building was completed under Batista, of course. 1959, we know what happened. 1961, as many people know, the US broke relations with Cuba, diplomatic relations, and moved out, basically closed the embassy, or they sort of mothballed it, if you know what that means. They just kind of, it went into a sort of limbo. And US and Cuba relations, as many people know, passed through the Swiss embassy for up until 2014, until the US embassy was reopened. Even when it was, no, I guess it was 77. It became the special interest section, et cetera, et cetera. And then there were more kind of direct relations at that point. This is the rush for visas in 1961. This is from the archive in Washington as well. There are a lot of images of what was happening to the building around this time. The rolling up of the symbolic flag. They took down the seal, of course, on the front of the building. And then I'm jumping forward to 1980 here. This is one of the protests around the Mariel crisis. You can see actually they're working on the building. They're renovating. I think they might be installing some of their air conditioners on the roof, fixing it. The building was extremely difficult to maintain because it was so close to the seafront, of course, and so it was being constantly decayed by salt seawater. And so this is where we get into the new symbolism of the building in a way. So it was designed to express all these aspirations of the United States, and pretty soon after the U.S. withdrew in '61, it became this focus for protests, and official protests. Again, many of you have probably either been on these as children or attended them or seen them over the years. The last major one was probably would be 2000, would be the Elian protests. And as we know, these are choreographed by the government often. Students are bussed in, et cetera, and it's this kind of mass spectacle that goes by the embassy. And the embassy is always the focus of these. Here's a good example from Granma. This is a double page. This is one of these choreographed protests. And they're mapped out very carefully. Actually, Granma, and you've seen this, of course, have these beautiful maps showing like where the drop-off points are, where the kind of focus of the protest is, and then the pickup points as you pass the U.S. embassy. So it's super charged symbol for Cuba at that point. And then sorry about the size of the image. So and then of course 2003, the invasion of Iraq. I don't know exactly who in the government was behind this project, but as many of you remember, there was a sort of cyclorama built around the embassy with these billboards projecting back to the U.S. the atrocities that they're committing in other parts of the world through their imperialist projects. The most obvious, obviously, being 2003, which was the biggest one and the clearest one, probably. So these are images, of course, of the torture in Abu Ghraib, big swastika, and this kind of went several points around the building. The U.S. this is under George Bush Jr. This was their retaliation to that. So it turned into this interesting public relations campaign, quite funny in many ways when you look at it. And of course, the U.S. The State Department set up this electronic billboard in the ambassador's floor of the embassy, with these messages projected to people. Of course, you could see them as far away as like Centro Havana. You could see them all from all along the Malecon again, but I'm sure many people remember this. And so there were messages. There were basically it was propaganda from the U.S. to try to sort of foment revolution or self-emancipation or something like this. So it's, I forget what this is, politica. Yeah, so this is like, we need political change or something like that. And then again, many people remember this. The mountain of flags was set up, and this was to block the electronic billboard, so you couldn't see it from other parts of Havana. And the flags, as many know, represented the stars, I think, was the victims of US or CIA terrorism, the Cuban victims of terrorism, and then I think the number of days of US imperialist project against Cuba, or the number of years, sorry. And so it was back and forth, and of course the most recent edition, and of course we have the Tribuno Anti-Imperialismo, also known as, of course, Protesto Uomo, that was built as part of this with the Martí statue at the end. So it was this kind of long axial urbanistic project pointing at the embassy again. And now, of course, many of you have seen there's a new sculpture, which is popularly named. Everything has its brilliant names in Cuba, as La Guillotina, which is, I'll show you at the very end. Everyone's, I'm sure, seen it already. So, very quickly, how do I deal with this material? How do I present it to the viewer? How do I kind of relate this very complex story? So what I decided to work with was this idea of layers. So I showed, the first documentation I showed you, of course, was the design and the construction of the building and its intended symbolism, of course. So in these vitrines, this is a big vitrine with 6 sections, and it's done in a very sober way. So actually what's under the glass there is a lot of that documentation I showed you of construction of the building and some of the press and how the interiors were designed, etc., and what the neighborhood was like, in a very sober layout, like as if we're in 1958. Like, things haven't really heated up so much, and we're still talking about this complex as this new and wonderful and modern piece of architecture and urbanism. And then layered on top in this very chaotic way is the other set of imagery I was showing you. So images of that electronic billboard, the mountain of flags, these kind of public relation back and forth that happened as the meaning of the building changed, and the U.S. kept trying to control it, and then the government in Cuba kept kind of pushing back against that. As the building is actually here, and it's the only time I've seen this done with an embassy anywhere in the world after all this embassy work. So it was a kind of a stroke of genius on the side of the Cuban government, I think, to think, it was like, we can use this for propaganda purposes, so they are as well. This is a vitrine, so you could kind of go through the material. There's the Viva Cuba Libre poster, some plans of the building, etc., some of the Granma spreads. And then the work, of course, enters these other forms, like the essay itself. So these are just a couple of spreads from the book. This is some of the, so the building was published quite a bit in different journals, and so there's a lot of discussion of that in the essay. Interiors, and then of course it was this idea of Cuba, modern Cuba, 1950s. Was the time, of course, of the José Luis Sert's Havana plan, the big plan piloto. Couple of images. That was going to be the government palace, and I think this is my last image. And this is the guillotine being installed in front of the embassy. And so this is where the kind of symbolism and meaning starts getting confusing or strange, and you're wondering, are those the lines of the Cuban flag? So you have the mullions of the facade of the embassy sort of bleeding through the flag, or is it the flag imposed over the image of the U.S.? So because of the transparency of the sculpture, there's this interesting ambiguity in the meaning of the thing, and changes again the meaning of the building itself. And that's what, is it 3 years ago, I think, that sculpture was installed, 2 or 3 years ago. Et voilà, that's it.
Muchas gracias, Terence. Tenemos unos 10 minutos para preguntas, conversación con los presentadores aquí, y después podemos seguir de manera informal en las otras áreas. Quizá lo que podemos hacer, como tenemos poco tiempo, es agrupar un par de preguntas, comentarios para nuestros presentadores sobre Neutra, sobre la embajada rusa, sobre Girón, sobre la embajada americana. Sí.
Well, sí. Thank you so much. I think all the four presentations, they share one thing, is that those are really lonely buildings who are denying their relation with Cuba. And Sylvia started with this idea that they didn't enter a building in Cuba, just located in Cuba, but not a Cuban building. And then the Soviet Union is a building that's not related with context, but related with time. It's related with another time, not this time. And also this building is looks like the government or a lot of people are trying to deny that this exists. And the Girón also, I love this idea that Marx said is on Cuba, not in Cuba. But at the same time, I think this kind of loneliness or this kind of bubble life, it also makes them special. And I think all of you, you have been like a pessimistic approach to its autistic relation with the city. And maybe I would like to hear more what do you think is a positive thing about being lonely and about not relating to the context, not in the sense like a cross-ventilation and the sun, but like this not relation with the city, what can we take from as a good example?
Non-relation.
First of all, it's a beautiful formulation about the paper. So maybe it's less a question than an observation in that sense. Yeah. So I don't know whether I would be so quick to make them all the same. However, the isolation has to do with a lot of other things. But at least in the case of the Neutra house, if I can be really frank, one of the things that is disturbing is the sense that it must have been a monument because it was made by an architect important in the first place. And it's not a great Neutra building, by Neutra's own standards. And it would be much more interesting to really understand it in relation to Raúl Álvarez, and to try to understand what it meant practically to build in a place where you are not, where the logic is different than the one that you know. I mean, everything I know about your work and where's your work? There you are. It is about this. Is about this condition of having to produce under impossible circumstances, impossible in legal terms, in geographic terms, in material terms, in labor terms. So if we say that is the Cuban condition, then that building is Cuban before you were born. So I think what's interesting to me is the collapse of those kinds of oppositions that you see operating there. And maybe because Cuba, in its geopolitical position, I mean, I think that Mark was back there. There you are, Mark. The smallest spot in the radio map plays the biggest role. That this kind of being able to do two things at once maybe is the Cuban anomaly. So maybe they're not in Cuba, maybe they're not isolated or not in Cuba, but rather they exemplify the Cuban the anomaly that is Cuba. So that's positive.
I like this idea of loneliness. Sorry, Mark. I like the idea of loneliness, but I think it's the same kind of condition with almost all these embassies. Of course, they're like UFOs that are dropped into these places. The U.S., because of the political situation through the Cold War and more recently, they're not so lonely because they get a lot of attention, but they get a lot of hatred, I'd say. And so they're kind of, maybe they are the lonely child who's sort of hated by everyone. There is maybe a sense of loneliness. So maybe that's a good one. maybe not so much in the urbanistic way.
So my building is lonely in a special way. It is lonely like a ghost that is waiting to become part of the material condition of possibility. It is waiting, it is the ghost that is knocking from the crypt, waiting to realize itself. It is lonely as someone who had not yet arrived into its time.
It's kind of confessions, right? I mean, my confession will be nothing pessimistic. I love that book.
Yeah.
I love that book. Number two, seems to me every work of architecture is a form of distancing from the context. So architects are people, almost human people, that treat everyday life as if it's a foreign city. So in a way we create the experience of leaving your life inside your life, right? So in this sense, the Girón is like kind of perfect. It's like it could not be more human and it could not be more sort of strangely positioned. I don't know why, but when he was speaking, I was thinking, yeah, if I take seriously what I'm saying, which sometimes I do, is Girón like a perfect image of a revolutionary project? Maybe. So it just was performing so well, this role of representing what it was not really proud of, that I wonder if it's the way in which it's fading more or less coincides with the kind of sadness of the revolutionary project. So I think it is in my fantasy life, yeah, again, maybe Edgar and Sylvia, it's a little bit more like Cuba than Cuba. It's really like, that's why nobody wants to talk about it. It's too close. Yeah. It's too close to the sadness that we all feel. It's very close.
Una de las cosas lindas de este tipo de encuentros y de eventos y del libro también es que crea no solamente diálogos entre edificios muy distintos, proyectos muy distantes, sino que, como vimos ahora, estas 4 presentaciones son como un collage constructivista que nos invitan a imaginar una Habana delirante en donde en la casa DeSchultess de Simonelli pudiéramos tener una vista directa del edificio Girón o de la embajada rusa, que sería un mundo delirante. O imaginarnos estos 4 proyectos en la misma cuadra del Vedado o de La Habana, la embajada rusa junto a la embajada americana, la casa DeSchultess y el Girón. Eso sería un proyecto que le gustaría a Rem Koolhaas y lo llamaría Delirios Havana. Muchas gracias.